Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and Lecture 23 of the Harvard Classics Volume number 4 of Paradise Lost, Book number 9. Hey, we're finally here, the most important book of Paradise Lost, and some have argued, I think I'm certainly in that camp as well, that this may be some of the most important writing in all of the English language. Not just because it's some of the most amazing poetry, which it is, but also because the implications of what's going to happen now in Book 9 of Paradise Lost, all of the arguments are now finally going to come to fruition for Milton, and of course by extension for all of the readers of the poem. And of course we'll include ourselves now, hopefully, in that. Now, let's pause for a moment and remind ourselves, if you haven't been following my lectures, I recommend that you go to learnstrong.net, go down that left-hand side, find my folder called Harvard Classics, and watch the old lectures, certainly the last few lectures, to get yourself caught up. Although obviously we're going to say a few things in review and in summary to try and help you be able to get on board. So much of our reading and our study now will bring us to this book. So let's review really quickly. That way we can get right into our study. First of all, let's remind ourselves that most scholars will divide Paradise Lost, the 12 books of Paradise Lost, up into 3 parts, with, of course, each of the 4 books. Books 1 through 4, Part 1, books 5 through 8, Part 2, books 9 through 12, Part 3. So you can see that in Book 9 now, we are about to begin the 3rd and final part of Paradise Lost. Let's just review quickly the different things that have happened. And I hope that you're looking back at your notes. I hope that you're working back through this one more time, again, as we kind of walk through the text as we get ready for examinations and the like. Book 1, we have, of course, that famous invocation, all our woes, we're told, as at the very beginning of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree brought death into the world and all our woes. This will be the moment everything changes for Milton. Okay, so that will be already kind of brought up in the invocation in Book 1. We meet Satan. He has just recently been tossed out of heaven because of a lost battle. He and his archangels, they build pandemonium at the conclusion of Book 1. Book 2, you'll recall, is that famous conversation between Satan, Beelzebub, and the other demonic forces, angels, as they all decide, ultimately, this is the plan. We're going to send Satan. He's going to go on this long journey, very much almost like an epic hero of a kind, to go escape hell and begin to destroy God's plan of this new man, this new woman in Eden. Book 3, we see the Father, God, and the Son, the need for redemption, and the Son saying, I will do it because man and woman will ultimately eat from the forbidden fruit, which we will find out in Book 9 is actually an apple. Right, actually an apple, and it becomes that kind of famous symbol, the apple of knowledge and all of that. Book 4 is significant because we're going to come back to Book 4 again several times in Book 9. But here we meet Adam and Eve for the first time. We're introduced, of course, to that notion of the patriarchy. Remember that idea that there is a certain kind of divine order to the world where God sits at the top, men sit under God, and women sit under men. That is to say, they do what they are told and keep their mouths shut. That notion of the patriarchy, we talked about it in earlier lectures. That one will come back big time here in our study of Paradise Lost, Book 9. Books 5 and 6 are, of course, those famous flashback books where we will have Raphael, the angel, visiting with Adam and a silent Eve. And we'll tell about Satan's war in heaven, Satan's fall, along with a third of the angels of heaven, although technically they do leap out of heaven and a hole in the wall of heaven, instead of staying to suffer their fate because they have been defeated by the Son. Book 7, of course, Magnificent 7, we said, is the great hymn of creation. Book 8 is, again, that warning from Raphael about too much knowledge. You'll remember Eve leaves in Book 8 to go and tend to her flowers. This symbol of flowers is going to be crucial to our reading of Book 9 of Paradise Lost. So, finally, we get to the action book. Although, there's going to be a lot of talking. That can't surprise us. the obvious question, although there's a bunch of them and we'll get to them, but one of the most obvious questions is, dude, I've been reading now, if I've been reading at all in Paradise Lost, I've been reading for a long time, lots and lots of words, thousands of lines of poetry, and the obvious question is, why does it take Milton so long to finally get to the actual event of the fall itself? Again, to remind, and we did this in an earlier lecture, you can read, of course, Genesis 3 literally in a matter of minutes. It has taken us hours and hours to be able to finally get, of reading and study, to finally get to this moment. Why does it take so long? I think there's a lot of answers to that. I mean, Samuel Johnson, the great intellectual, said that none wanted this poem any longer, which was kind of a slam. I've often pointed out, Samuel Johnson never wrote even 10 lines of poetry as majestic as what Milton has written in Paradise Lost. And yet, Johnson spoke and continues to speak for a lot of my students and other readers who say, this is just too long. It's taking too long to get to the penultimate moment. Why did it take him so long? And I think one of the answers is, and it's a 3B observation, think about the last time that you, quote-unquote, sinned. Now, I'm not, and I've tried not to use Paradise Lost in any way as a text to preach to you, and so I don't want to do that, and I'm not doing that now, but just bear with me for a moment, right? Consider the last time you did something you knew was wrong, inappropriate, that led to some sense of shame or guilt. It will help if that was a premeditated act instead of a kind of an instinctive act of maybe rage or whatever. Think about this one. It takes time, yes, to work out a good enough reason to finally do it anyway, even though you know you probably should. Right? The most obvious example is as a kid, you walk into the store, you're going to steal something, you walk up and down the aisle, you're working this out, am I going to do this, am I not going to do this? That internal struggle. Think about maybe if you have this in your life, you decide that you're going to go ahead and go for somebody who just might be already taken. That is to say, your girlfriend or your boyfriend, or your friend's girlfriend or boyfriend. And you decide, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and go for this, maybe even mess around with that individual. Should I do it? Should I not do it? Of course, students all know this one, right? They have to, sooner or later, come to the decision. I say all, many students. No. Am I going to cheat on a major exam? Am I not going to cheat on a major exam? Is it worth it? Notice that there's a lot of internal thinking, a lot of language that's going to be associated with it. Milton wants us to feel the fall and learn something. He's been setting us up, right, as we get ready. Of course, we're now ready. And one of the obvious questions, I say it's obvious, I hope that I can help you to see how obvious it is. One of the obvious questions is, how do you read, for example, and watch, because it's very dramatic here, we're going to say more about that in a little bit in regards to our comments on Shakespeare, Eve and her decision. For example, do you see Eve as the villain of this text in many ways, because ultimately she's the one who eats from the forbidden fruit? First, she gets Adam to do it. Of course, Christian theology and St. Augustine's tradition will certainly see it this way. Or do you rather view Eve, as many postmodern readers of this text will view her, as the metaphor of the ultimate hero, the one who has to push against the bounds of knowledge, for example, and go for it, the discoverer? That is to say, the one who ultimately is the personification of what science is all about, pushing against the bounds of knowledge. How do you see it? Okay? Maybe we would ask, do you view Eve as Promethean? Back to an earlier myth that we've talked about, right? That hero who will say to God Zeus, I don't care what you tell me, I'm doing it anyway. Wow. Let's do some quick reminding now as we get into this conversation. First of all, let's remind ourselves that in 303 we define learning as the capacity or the ability, desire to connect new information to old information. This is going to be huge for us. For example, there are so many ways to read Paradise Lost Book 9. One of the ways I'm going to challenge you, and I'll try and play the game even as we're doing our study together, is Milton was very influenced by Shakespeare. I mean, remember it. Hamlet is 1600, Milton born 1608. He writes a really famous sonnet that we talked about in an earlier lecture on Shakespeare. Milton considers Shakespeare one of the greatest writers of all time, and those great tragedies that we study together, those plays of Hamlet and of Lear and of Othello and of Romeo and Juliet, J.C., Julius Caesar, all of those tragedies I want you to keep in your mind's eye, and especially the soliloquies in those tragedies that you and I have studied together, okay? Because they're going to come back. They will. And we're gonna maybe begin to wonder, is Milton writing playing a game of somehow relating to so many of those other texts, those earlier texts? Let's remind ourselves that we are looking always when we read at three levels. A, or level one, what does the text say? Brief summary. Level two, what does the text mean? 2A, messages, themes. 2B, rhetoric, not what the poet Milton says, but how he says it. And then finally, level three, how do I relate to a text like this? At 3A, how do I relate this idea, this text, to other texts and to world events that I know of? And then finally, 3B, how do I relate this text to me? Also, let's remind, and we've said this in earlier lectures, that we are studying Paradise Lost from three perspectives. We want to see Paradise Lost as an epic. It'll be interesting that here, Milton himself will shift, and he will say, I am writing a different kind of epic. I am telling a now tragic story. And he will then, Milton, will inject into the conversation Aristotelian poetics. We'll have to review that now just for a moment. Remember what Aristotle said in his classic text, right? Remember, it's Aristotle's Poetics, okay? And I know I've given other lectures on this, but let's just review this stuff just to make sure we're all on board, right? Aristotle says in Poetics that tragedy is a very special kind of genre, different from comedy in this regard. You have a protagonist. Now, what is the protagonist in favor of? What does that mean? Well, that means the audience will select one character with whom the audience identifies. That's a key word, right, for our notes. Well, identifies in what way? Well, this protagonist has to go through a fall, right? That fall will ultimately lead the audience to identify with that fall through a process called catharsis. In other words, purgation, yes? Of what? Two primary emotions, fear and pity. Now, of course, for Aristotle, the greatest example of this, and this is a text we'll have to come back to later as we study Book 9, certainly it's clear it's in the mind of Milton, is the great Oedipus Rex of Sophocles. Oedipus, of course, he doesn't want to kill his dad, marry his mom, and have 4 children with his mother. And so when he is warned that that might happen, he flees from his city of Corinth. But unfortunately, he's running right into the jaws of it, isn't he? Right? Okay. And of course, when the play opens, all of the backstory, the audience of all of us we already know, has already happened. Unknowingly, he's killed his father right before the crossroads. He has, of course, answered the question of the riddle of the Sphinx. What animal walks on 4 legs in the morning, on 2 legs at noon, on 3 legs in the evening? A human being, right? And then because there's an available kingship, he accepts the beautiful Queen Jacusta's invitation. He marries his own mother. He has 4 children, 2 sons, 2 daughters. And at the moment that the play will open, there is a plague that's hitting the city of Thebes, and Oedipus is told it's because the old king Laius, he was murdered. You have to avenge the murder. And of course, it will be the darkest of ironies that Oedipus will say, I will get to the bottom of this. Now, what Aristotle says in Poetics is that as Oedipus is going through this process, of course, this fall has everything to do with hamartia, a tragic flaw, right? And more particularly often it's hubris, right? Or excessive pride. These ideas are, of course, crucial to understanding Western thought. And I believe reading Paradise Lost, certainly Milton is heading us in that direction by telling us early on in his 4th invocation to amuse that he's going to tell now a tragic story, a tragedy. Ultimately, of course, there is a fall, But the most important thing about this identification, and this is crucial to understanding, I believe, the influence of Aristotle's Poetic, is that Aristotle says, when you are watching the performance, I mean, here's the performance right out on stage. You're sitting here, right? And up on the stage, here is the performance, right? We have this tendency to think, that the drama is happening on stage. It's the genius of Aristotle that he says, no. It is quite the opposite. The true drama is not what's happening on stage at all, but rather what's happening out here in the audience. Why? Because the true drama is a psychological drama. Because as the protagonist falls, the audience will identify with that fall and will experience fear. Oh man, I can't imagine if I were to unknowingly kill my dad and marry my mom. That's just pathetic. I hate it in every way that I can imagine. Fear about possibly doing something, think of it, doing something that will have a ripple effect. And I don't realize that ripple effect, can we call it fallout, until after the fall. That will, of course, for us happen in Book 9. We'll see it as well in our continuing conversation in Book 10. But there's also this thing about pity. Compassion is born in the moment that I watch somebody else go through something really terrible and I say, oh man, it would totally stink to be that person. I feel for Oedipus at the end when he is this crushed and broken character. He's so amazingly strong at the beginning, and by the end, this crushed and broken character being led off stage by his own, the only daughter who will stay with him. Ismene has left him, Antigone. This is all standing, in many ways, behind now what Milton is going to do with his epic. And so we want to pay attention to that. The other thing, write it down, is that we want to pay attention to the powerful symbols of book number 9. I'm going to leave to you to work with me and to see the symbols that you like best. But I am going to point this one out because you cannot miss it. And it is simply the symbol of the flower, the rose. Now, the multifoliate rose we've spoken about already is a powerful symbol in Dante's Divine Comedy. We're going to see it here in powerful ways as we work through it. We've also said Paradise Lost we will be studying as a philosophic or a theological text. You'll remember that we asked the question of theodicy. How do you account for the fact that there is evil, suffering, pain, bad stuff in a world created by an all-powerful, all-loving deity? Milton has said in his invocation and repeatedly through his poem that his goal is to justify, explain, the ways of God to men. So our question here will be by Book 9. We're going to meet finally fully Milton's theodicy. And our question will be, is God at fault? Is Adam at fault? Is Eve at fault? Is Satan at fault? There's going to be this question for us as we finally will meet this one. We'll also point out the power of language. This you definitely want to write down. The power of language. For example, there's two words that I want you to be kind of concentrating on as we go through. The word play and the word trial. Both of them are going to have a major import in our study reading of Paradise Lost Book 9. Finally, we'll read Paradise Lost not only as epic, not only as philosophic, theological text, but we're going to see it as a political text. And we have splayed this study of politics into two. One, the psychological rendering, right? For example, we're going to pay attention to the psychological single mind of Eve, of Adam, as they go through the process of the fall. And as a sociological political text, and in this regards, when you put two or more people together, what begins to happen? Well, we're going to see this. At the beginning of the poem, Adam and Eve are together, and they have an interesting conversation about whether Eve should go off by herself and go work in the flowers, gardening. And by the end, well, they're together, but are they together? And what does it say about any relationship that it seems to always begin with ecstasy and end with arguing? We see this all the time in the halls of a high school, don't we? What's up with that? Well, let's say it out loud. Book 9, of course, is going to raise all kinds of questions Milton knows it. It's why he invokes the fourth time the invocation of the Muse. He did it at book 1, he did it at book 3, he did it at book 7, and now he's coming back one more time to ask for the help of the Holy Spirit, his Muse, to say, I hope I don't screw this up when I tell this story. Why? I think there's an answer to this. Because he knows that book 9 is the key to everything that he's trying to present in his, what he calls, great argument. By argument here he means defense. In other words, let me explain to you why it's not God's fault that there's sin and suffering in the pain in the world. But of course there's all kinds of questions. We want to list them now as we set ourselves up for this study. Are Adam and Eve really free? Multiple questions. Are Adam and Eve really free? Has God done enough? For example, he lets Satan escape through Gabriel at the conclusion of book 4. If God really doesn't want Adam and Eve to fall, then why in heaven's name does he allow for Satan to escape? And of course the answer will be, again expressed in book 9, no. Human beings have to be created free so they can then make their decision of their own accord to either obey or disobey God. Of course, the opening lines of book 1 are going to suggest for us, of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree brought death into the world and all our woe. Think about this. All evil is explained by Milton by the eating of an apple that has been disapproved of by God in the Genesis 3 account, the story that we talked about earlier. And then everything bad that happens, all of the natural evil, quote-unquote evil of the world, hurricanes and tornadoes and cancers and all of that, and all of the bad stuff that happens that's self-chosen evil, sin of any number of kinds, all of that is explained in this moment. Which begs an interesting question. If this event is so unbelievably significant and important in the history of the world,